So to introduce you to the concept of control templates, I've gone ahead and chosen the control button. Let's create a template for the button control. Now for some controls, building a template is actually fairly complex. Button is a good choice for us to start with though because it's relatively easy. In fact, I'd say that button is among the simplest templates that you could create, and this seems to be where everyone begins to learn about templating. So creating a button template is kind of like your initiation into templating. And it's also a good one to start with because it does a really good job of illustrating the things that we want to learn about. Now before we can create a template for the button, let's go ahead and create just a regular button. So if you're not already there, make sure you're in XAMLPad, and then add a button with a width of 100, a height of 30, and then go ahead and set the content property to any content you want. Now if I hit refresh, you can see that we've just created a really simple button. Now like I mentioned, controls will by default get their template from the system. So this button looks and behaves like other Windows buttons. But now let's go ahead and customize this. To start off, we want to set the template property on the button. And to do this, notice that again we're using the complex property syntax that allows us to set properties using complex values. Now the value for this property is going to be an object of type control template. And to let the control template know what kind of object we're creating a template for, we set the target type property. And here we're going to use another markup extension, which is x:type. And then give it the type button. The x:type markup extension is essentially the same thing as saying type of button. And so that tells the control template that we're creating a template for type of button. So now we've created our first control template, and if we refresh this, we'll see that actually the button disappeared. Now maybe that isn't what you were expecting, but the reason it disappeared is because there's no content in our control template yet. So let's add some content to create the visuals for our button. Now this is a fair amount of typing, so bear with me for just a second. First thing I'm going to do is add a grid, and that will be the main layout container for our button visuals. And the next thing I want to do is add two border elements, and these will form the substance of the button. In other words, this is the thing that we'll see in the template. So I'll give this first border a background of silver. We'll set the border brush to black. We'll set the border thickness to be a value of 0, 0, 1, 1. This gives us a border on just the right and the bottom sides. And finally, let's set the corner radius to 4. Now we can copy this to insert our next border. So let's go back to the beginning of the row, highlight it and copy, and now paste it. And make sure that when you paste it, it's still a child of the grid. Now here we don't need the background again, and we want to make the border brush white. And this time we only want the border brush to be on the left and the top. So we change the border thickness to a value of 1, 1, 0, 0. And finally, let's change the background of the page to be a darker color so that we can actually see that white border. Okay, so now we can go ahead and refresh this to see our newly formed button template. Alright, so believe it or not, this is an actual button. And I think this is really exciting. In fact, this is every bit as much a button as the system button that we saw earlier. From a programming perspective, in fact, there's no difference. A click on this button would result in a click event just like clicking on any other button would. You may have noticed one thing that's missing about this button though, and that's the fact that there's no content. Our content appears to have disappeared. And the reason for that is we haven't allocated a place for it inside of the template. Now to allocate a place for it, we can use a handy helper control called Content Presenter. So let's go ahead and add a Content Presenter to our template. Now when you add this, make sure that it's still inside of the grid, but it comes after the two borders. Otherwise you still won't be able to see the content. Now Content Presenter is a really handy little control. It does one thing, and that thing is display content. And in fact, Content Presenter is actually capable of displaying all of the rich content that you might place inside of a button. In our example, we just have a string, but Content Presenter would be very capable of displaying everything from data objects with templates to other rich content like other elements or even something like a video. So now let's go ahead and refresh and you can see the content appear. Alright, so there's our content, but you might have noticed that it's a little bit off-center. The thing to keep in mind about a Content Presenter is it behaves just like any other element. So if we want that content to show up in the middle, we need to set both the vertical alignment property and the horizontal alignment property both to center. So let's do that. And now, if we refresh, you can see that the content shows up in the middle.